Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lift Economy. My guest today is repeat guest Garret Bucks. Garrett is the founder of the Barnraisers project, which trains white people who don't think of themselves as activists on how to welcome their communities and networks into the work of justice and liberation. He's also the creator of The White Pages, a newsletter about white people's relationship both to racism and to each other. He's from Montana, but lives in Milwaukee now with his wife and 2 kids. And he's just published his first book, The Right Kind of White. Garrett, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks, Ryan. It's great to be back.
Yeah, I was realizing our last conversation was the heady days of September 2021, when people were really passionate about racial justice and dismantling white supremacy, and seems to have gone down a little bit since then. Is that your take is like the shift?
There is, unfortunately, a pattern to these things that, every moment that we've had a either extended or furtive racial reckoning as a country, there has been a backlash to that. And then there has been a fallow period after that. And so I think every time we go through one, I think in particular those of us who focus on white people, we hope maybe this one will be different. But I think it's also part of understanding whiteness is understanding this pattern. And I don't think we're going to transform it without understanding. So yes, totally. We are not in the same place we were in September of 2021. And there's a problem with that, but there's also an opportunity in realizing that.
Yeah. And so this new book titled The Right Kind of White, what is the right kind of white?
Great question. It is something that I am not going to tell you how to do or be in the book. In fact, the book is going to trace the shape of a life, mine specifically, it's a memoir, that was overly obsessed for a long time with thinking I could be the right kind of white. And by that, I mean that I was overly obsessed for a big portion of my life with trying to define myself in relation to other white people and think that if I stood out the best way as the most social justice-y, as the most anti-racist, also as the most feminist man, etc., that somehow I would transcend everything about whiteness that made me feel guilty, everything about maleness that made me feel guilty, all of the shame, all of the questions about what wasn't earned in my life, but that I could cleave that from myself by positively comparing myself to other white people. And so the book is about where that impetus came from for me, hopefully in a way that inspires in particular white progressive readers to see themselves and ask the same question, where does that show up for myself? It then explores where that got me, both positively in terms of awakening to a world of anti-racism, but also where it got me in terms of not living up to my aspirations for who I was in my community, the impact I was having in the world, and more so whether the shape of my life was what I hoped it would be or not. And then it finishes the book with perhaps a peek at an alternative, a peek of something to care about, still caring passionate about justice, that isn't obsessed with the appearance of being good, but hopefully more curious about what it actually looks like to do good.
I love that. And as someone who has gone through a white exceptionalism phase of like, I am not white, I am the white guy that you can trust, or I am the one, I've definitely tried to be that white person. Why do you think so many of us white folks interested in anti-racism like have this deep need to be liked by Black folks or separated from other white folks? Like, what is that?
Well, I'm going to back up a little bit. I think it's an amazing question because both you and I, because of our own background, right, are focusing on some of the weird things us as white progressives do. But I do think, and what I lay out in the introduction, is that this pattern of whiteness seeing itself in the mirror, whether we admit it or not liking what we see, when we notice our whiteness, when we have to face even a little bit the reality of our whiteness, and then afterwards defining ourselves in relation to an other, that's not something that just white progressives do. That when a Trump supporter says that I don't see race, I don't see color, and all of you critical race theorists are being divisive, you're the ones not living Martin Luther King's dream, they're doing the same thing too. They're saying that there is another group of white people out there who is part of the problem, the guilt-ridden, the angsty, the CRT-loving white liberals like myself. So too is a white person who says, oh, I don't see politics that's too divisive, is looking at other sets of folks, in particular other white people, and say, something about how they are approaching their whiteness is making me uncomfortable, and therefore I'm going to set myself here against them. So I don't think it's just us. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity in realizing that it's not just us. And there's a potential for a point of connection across ideology, across class, across geography, between white people, when we realize we're all doing a version of this. But then to come to the version that you and I have done, right? And I love the way you put it, that our particular version of defining our whiteness in relationship to each other often relies on affirmation and validation from people of color. And that's another tricky thing, because obviously it is a positive thing if you are interested in anti-racism, if you are recognizing that as a white person, there is a limit to your perspective, there is a part of experience in the world that you do not understand because of where you're at in hierarchies of power and privilege. And also just as a caring member of multiracial communities that wants to be a community member, there is so much that is positive in the impetus to have authentic relationships with Black and Brown and Indigenous folks in your life, that there is such a positive impulse in trying to learn from perspectives that are different from yours, trying to decenter yourself. So it's not all bad. But I had to ask myself the question, as I do throughout the course of my book, there's a lot of good there, but if I'm really honest with myself, how much am I making my relationships with Black and brown folks in my life, and I walk through friends of mine, students of mine, colleagues of mine, neighbors of mine, people I claim to be neighbors, but that I didn't really know. How much is this really more about me than it is them? And one of the ironic things by focusing this book, which is my editor and I really wanted to focus this book on, there's a lot of people who write white stories about what was my relationship to racism, how did I discover I was being bad for Black and brown people. We really wanted to start from the question of what was my relationship to other white people. But it's really interesting that you can't do that with also realizing that all of these foils I set up throughout my life of these other white people that I wanted to distinguish myself from, that path of distinguishing was also making me tokenize my relationships with people of color. Because no matter how authentic they were, no matter how much I did care for them as people, there was also a point in the back of my mind that was like, yeah, look at me. Those other folks don't have these relationships. Those other folks aren't being welcomed in these conversations about how other white people are trash. Those other people are not getting to sit in these professional or personal spaces like I am. So I must be doing something right. And when you introduce that to a relationship, that also causes a real dilemma, right? So this ended up by focusing on my relationship to other white people. I also really revealed some things that I'm not proud of in terms of what really was going on in a lot of what I would have just said were authentic, mutualistic friendships and professional relationships throughout my life.
Yeah. Can you set the there's a great scene in the book where you take your colleagues out to lunch, or maybe it's like to a bar.
A happy hour, yeah.
Yes, a happy hour. Can you tell folks that? I think it illustrates what you're talking about, like what you were hoping for from your colleagues and like why you were so proud to have this like multiracial group, et cetera.
Yeah, so a little bit of context here. So the scene takes place in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is known as a post-industrial Rust Belt city where I live and love. And it is a deeply segregated city, right? And so it is a city where where every aspect of people's lives, including a lot of people's workplaces, are deeply segregated, and a lot of people's social lives are deeply segregated. So that's the first piece of context. Second piece of context is that At the time, I was the executive director of Teach for America Milwaukee, a education nonprofit that I had lots of feelings about, right? Lots of feelings of, am I doing the right thing? Is the work we're doing the right kind of work? Have I sold out because I've got this fancy title? I had all of these questions about it that I wasn't necessarily wrestling with like outwardly. And I was instead wrestling with them by just trying to prove my own righteousness. And when I put those two things together, one of the things I was really proud of in that era was that as executive director, the white male executive director, so I didn't give up a leadership position, but that I was really proud of that our team was one of the most authentically diverse, in terms of racial background, in terms of the class background. We all had college degrees at that point, but the class background we had grown up in. We were relatively young, but had some really interesting age diversity as well. And so I was really, really proud of how diverse our team was compared to other nonprofits in town and compared to other Teach for America regions. I was really, really proud of how much we were doing these radical talks about equity and inclusiveness. So I thought we were really doing the work and we were challenging ourselves, and we were a different organization than we had been before. And that I, in particular, had taken all the feedback that other white male bosses hadn't. And I also, because I was devoting so much time for this, I also put a story onto who that group was that I probably wasn't admitting how much I needed that story, that we weren't just all of those things, but that we were also best friends, and that all that we were doing on workplace culture and community meant that, yeah, of course I was the boss and we were a hierarchical system, but we had transcended that in some sort of way. And of course, why would that story be important to me? Because all of this, the white male boss who wasn't like the other white male bosses, the diverse workplace that was really authentic in their relationships to it, all of that, as much, I wasn't admitting this outwardly, proved a story about myself and who I was. And so as much as I was saying that this was for a greater good, there was a lot that was self-serving about that. And it's funny how, when you build a house of cards and a story that's not true, it's really funny, sometimes the very banal moments when that house of cards crumbles, right? So I give all this context to say, feeling great about things, feeling we are an incredible group. And amongst the other things that I did in this office, I was like, we do some sort of social event for everyone's birthdays. So that included my birthday. I was turning 35 and it was like, let's go out to this happy hour at this bar, this cool bar nearby our office. It's got good cheese curds. We're going to have a great time, right? And it was a Friday evening, starting off, it feels exactly like I want it to feel. Everyone's there. The camaraderie seems to be really good. And in fact, not just can I look at our group and say, yep, this looks like a group of diverse friends hanging out authentically. But that evening, we had other people in the bar comment on oh man, you guys are colleagues? You don't see that in Milwaukee. You don't see that kind of diverse set of colleagues hanging out and enjoying time with each other. And try to play that off, but that compliment from other folks seeing us, noticing our diversity made me feel pretty darn good about myself, right? And so I set up this scene, and then something very normal takes place. Something very predictable takes place. Something that if I was viewing any of this rationally, if I didn't have kind of an insincere and unsustainable story built up in my mind about who I was as a boss, wouldn't have shaken me at all. Namely, what happens is, after about a half hour of hanging out at this workplace mandated happy hour on a Friday night, people got to leave. People got to go. And it happens pretty suddenly. And I realized, right when it did, what this actually was, right? It was a group of people who were following their boss's mandate to come hang out. They weren't leaving because they were angry or mad or that we actually had a terrible culture like that. But it did reveal that this was a transaction, that this was something I had asked them to do as a workplace. They had fulfilled that duty, and then they were now going to go home. And when I saw that so clearly, that was one of those moments that started for me peeling back the facade, A, of what I thought I had done, and then B, the fact that it shook me, and it did shook me. I tried to play it off, but folks could notice that I looked shaken and sad and surprised. And then when they all left, I just bawled in my car. Just because people left my birthday early, that's a small thing to bawl over. And the fact that it hit me that hard, right, I then had to wrestle with why did this have so much meaning for me? This making a group of colleagues, black and brown and white colleagues, hang out together after work. Why did that have so much outsized meaning for me? And what would it look like to give up that meaning, right? Because I realized in that moment the silliness of it, but I also realized if these relationships are not what I think they are, that means that I haven't actually been treating these folks that I do care about, that I do respect, that I do admire as people. I have been interested in them as symbols for what they can prove about me. And that's a pretty crappy way to go about relationships in your life.
Thanks for that honesty and vulnerability. And I think you do that a lot in the book around just being very vulnerable. Like, this is what's come up for me. And I think it makes the book relatable in a lot of ways. And I do want to say happy belated birthday, because I know March 9th, right? It's like comes up in the book.
Cool thing about writing a memoir, you can sneak things in, like letting people know when your birthday is.
Yes, I love
Highly
it.
suggest it. Yeah.
And, one of the other stories that maybe is along a similar theme of like trying to be different, you wrote about the idea of DEI trainings at work, and you sort of knew the game. Like, I'm kind of paraphrasing, but it was this idea of confirm and regurgitate what I already knew to be true, and then judge other white people who kind of like don't get it, and then maybe commiserate with like women of color that you have a special relationship with about how awful the other white people are. That was sort of like the game, right?
Well, I did a bunch of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And was this realization that you were doing this around the same time, or like, how did you sort of...
It was. Yeah. The sections of the book that you're talking about right now appear in this period of time post Michael Brown's murder in Ferguson, Missouri, and pretty much up to the point of Trump's election in 2016. And so all of this was the
Facebook, the burner posts. Yeah.
Absolutely. This was peak self-righteous, me having increased questions about what my life had led up to at this point, but not wrestling with those questions. Increased questions in particular about the efficacy of my social justice commitments, but not wrestling with those questions. Getting increasing evidence, as per the anecdote we just talked about at the bar, right, that a lot of relationships that I thought were really authentic were actually not. And for a while, I think that hopefully I'm not the only one who does this. Hopefully there's some listeners who have made this mistake as well, so I don't feel as alone. But when you are hitting deeper and deeper levels of cognitive dissonance, sometimes you sit with that, and sometimes you have an epiphanal moment from that. But other times you dig in deeper. And so I started having more and more realizations during this time period that the way I'm living my life, actually, if I say what I care about is community, what I care about is justice, what I care about is adding my little contribution to the broader efforts to build a better world, I've got a lot of evidence that I'm actually not doing that in practice. But I'm not ready to wrestle with that yet. So here's how it's going to come out. It's going to come out in I'm making strident Facebook posts and writing media messages, and I'm getting a lot of validation from people for it. And they're like, oh, now this is being an ally, right? Or I have learned how to sit in, as you just brought up, a DEI training, and all these other white people are making all the mistakes. They're either talking too much or talking too little, or they are centering themselves, whereas I've got my perfect, I'm listening well. And all of this, it's not that I'm saying things or doing things that I don't care about. And I think that push-pull is always present throughout the book. Like, these are relationships I care about. These are people I care about. These are ways of viewing the world and understanding systems that I authentically am wrestling with. But I'm having to notice there's also another piece of this that, like, I am using them. I am using them to feel better about myself. And by them, I mean the Facebook posts, my positionality in somebody who can say a right thing in response to tragedy. In terms of the systems and institutions of things like diversity trainings themselves, I am using them. And then, of course, most painfully, even though I don't want to admit that I'm doing this, that I'm using my friends and colleagues, in particular colleagues of color, as this person's talking to me about how bad the other white person is, then I'm doing something right. And so the book traces me having things that should have been deeper realizations, but then for a while, for the course of a few years, digging in even deeper until finally, for slowly but surely, I start running out of track. And more importantly, I start realizing that I'm running out of track. And so then there's an opening to transformation piece that starts opening up more between 2016 and 2019.
Yeah. Let's talk about that period of time. And I know in mid 2020, you started talking about having like tenderness and affection for white people for the first time. And so maybe what is this like 2016 to 2019 lead up to this sort of like, oh, like I can be tender and like not have to be separate from other white people?
Yeah, it was gradual. And there are moments that I thought I had gotten there, but I hadn't fully gotten there. But the first step really did happen with this noticing of the rise of Trump and the rise of Trump's base. And there were a couple of moments in particular previous to the election that I talk about in the book where I had recently had an experience of showing up in the aftermath of a street uprising here in Milwaukee after a police officer had killed a black man, an unarmed black man, Sylville Smith. And shortly after, I went to the aftermath of that uprising and had to wrestle with, even though this was an uprising not far from where I lived, on a street that was very familiar to me, that actually I didn't know anyone here, and that in this majority black community where this had happened, and that I had just written one of my many posts and messages about white people, this is what you should do in this moment. And this time I was talking about like, this happened in my community. And then I realized that, oh, this is actually not my community. I have pretended it's my community. I've tried to glom onto it as my community. But when I realized that there was nothing for me to do there, that I didn't know enough people or have enough relationships that I could actually show up for people in a meaningful way, I had that experience. Then shortly after, right after that happened, partially because of the uprising, Donald Trump came to a Milwaukee exurb, West Bend, which is a town where my grandfather-in-law lived. And I watched that rally. And in that rally, I noticed that, and I was watching it as a self-satisfied liberal to like find all the things that Trump was doing wrong. And actually discovered that his rhetoric that night, it was cartoonish and terrible. But the particular way that it was cartoonish and terrible was that he was talking about the black community as a them, right? That they should support me for this reason. And I realized as I listened to him that at least he was being honest about it, that he was looking at the black community as a them that should do something for him. And I realized, oh, that's exactly what I was doing. And then I tell further, there's a further layer of that as I tell the story of seeing an image of a particular Trump supporter in the crowd that night that I won't go fully into that story, but that had to take me back to connections to my grandparents and my own lineage and a whole different thread of the story of my connection to the places that have raised me that also runs through the book. But it was a very haunting experience. And that night started making me think in a different way about how much I have in common with other white people. And when I say other white people, I mean the full swath of white people across class, across geography, across ideology, across other layers of difference. And so that was the first layer, right? And it was enough of a layer that after Trump's election, I started even officially starting the work on what would eventually become Barnraisers project, my organizing project with other white people. But even then, there were a couple of years where the way I was going about it was still very focused. I was still addicted a little bit to a salvation story. Although this time I was focused not on trying to be a white savior in communities of color, I was now wanting to save other white people from white supremacy. I still wanted to be this big, bold leadership voice. And there was a period of time where I was trying to make a big, bold philanthropic pitch on how Barnraisers Project, my organizing idea, was going to change the world and change whiteness. And even though I had more of a sense of connection with white people in that moment, it was still at a bit of a reserve, still at a bit of a remove that I wanted to be the leader of anti-racist white people still. And, there's a lot of ways to come to the realizations I did without having to experience as a white straight guy some element of marginality for the first time, but it happened. The last step that really influenced me getting over myself in different ways was a chronic illness and having to sit in a moment where I finally had to sit with admitting how many of my desires and drives in the world were really pretty basic. That I was sick and doctors were not understanding why I was sick. And this is in 2019 now. And all I wanted, I realized, was I wanted to be understood. I wanted somebody to be curious about me. And when I realized that's all I'd wanted all this time, it's a pretty basic realization, that's what I realized, like, oh, that's the most basic human craving of all. And that's when I realized that what I had to offer other white people wasn't a set of expertise that the rest of us don't have, but it was a recognition that I'm a member of this group that is in a real mess, that is heirs to a system that has benefited us tremendously, but that, whether we admit it or not, none of us actually want, because it is a system of separation and a system of domination and a system of alienation. And I'm a member of that group. And that group is full of a lot of broken people who are searching for connection, being seen, being heard. And often that leads, as it did for me, in lots of unhelpful ways. But there is a gift in the common bond that we are in that together. And it turns out that realization happened for me before 2020, which meant that I had the gift then of watching from home with my kids, in a full-time childcare moment at that moment, watching the summer of 2020 and watching whiteness on display, loud and proud, and as I can talk about in the book, desperately reaching out to be seen, either be it radical or progressive or conservative in different ways. And whereas at every single moment in time, my impetus would have been one of two things. One would have been to race to try to be smarter or better or louder than the other white people doing it, just race to critique, or race to make sure that I was not lumped in with white people who were making a mistake, or in particular, race to some sort of leadership role. I just realized that, oh, these people, white people, in all of our brokenness, in all of our weirdness, in all of our thirstiness for attention, in all of our earnest desire to do better, often expressed in really, really the wrong ways. Oh, these are my people. And I have something to figure out with my people. And I want to. And that felt really, really different than it had at any other stage in my life. And that's when, I retooled Barnraisers, but less as a big, bold idea that's going to change everything, and more of an offering, right? An offering that, hey, I've thought a lot about how to train each other, white people, to work on issues of justice with one another. And I think that's a useful offering. Would anyone want to come to it? And then the last few years have just been the end result of welcoming more and more people and therefore building more and more relationships. It's how you and I met, which is just such a gift. And the world has not been saved, right? In fact, one could argue that from the time that I started Barnraisers to now, right, we have less white people focusing on anti-racism than we did, right? But what is also true is now I am connected to stories of struggle, to stories of change, to stories of community transformation in hundreds of different places across the world right now. And a lot of the stories of connection are still people who are really messed up who don't know what to do, myself included. But we're no longer just figuring it out alone. And I'm no longer just figuring out alone. And that feels like a much better shape of a life than the one I was on for a while.
I love it. We're both parents. I think our kids are around the same age. Do you read Dr. Becky at all? Good Inside?
No.
No? Okay.
Yeah, you do. Tell me more.
Well, it's interesting because her belief is that every child is good inside. You're a good kid having a hard time. And if you sort of have that same belief extended to white people, it's actually like, it's weird because in anti-racism, there can be like a negative association of being like, I'm a good white person, seen as like not actually someone who understands. But I do think there's this fundamental belief, which I agree with, and maybe something you're pointing to, which is like white people can be good inside too. And if you almost have to have that belief. Otherwise, it's like we're all fucked because If we assume that other people are like actually evil or bad inside at their core, then I don't know what's possible to fix things.
As you're talking, I reached for my copy of Baldwin's No Name in the Streets, because there's this quote that very much was at the center for me as I was working on this book. And I think it's a quote you could take in two different directions. But, Baldwin writes, "Incontestably, alas, most people are not, in action, worth very much. And yet every human being is an unprecedented miracle. One tries to treat them as the miracles they are while trying to protect oneself against the disasters they've become," right? And you can look at that quote, and there's moments, right, of despairing where the part of that quote that stands out is the disasters they've become. And that's part of the story, right? That the fundamental paradox of humanity is we, just as individuals, do a lot of harm to each other. And then when you layer on systems of harm in which we are embedded, we do a whole heck of a lot more harm, right? That those of us who are white do a whole heck of a lot more harm. Those of us who are male do a heck of a lot more harm. Those of us who are not poor do a whole heck of a lot more harm. Those of us who are straight, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there is no community within whiteness without realizing that part of the equation, that we are a community of disasters. We are a community of people who are messes, who are causing harm in big and little ways every single day. And like all human beings, we're all miracles. Like all human beings, there is deeply embedded in who we are an ability and a desire to love and be loving, to care and to give care. And that is true at the same time. So being a radical community with other white people is not saying that I'm going to love you in spite of white supremacy, or I'm going to love you ignoring white supremacy. I'm going to say, I'm going to love you whether we recognize it or not, recognizing that I bet deep down inside we want something better for the world, and we want something better for our role in the world than the one we've fallen into.
I love it. And I appreciate you pulling the James Baldwin right off the shelf with the quotation. It was great.
I look like I'm really well prepared. It happens that you are sitting next. I'm not organized in most ways except an alphabetized bookshelf. I happen to be sitting in front of the bees.
I love it.
So in this case, fortuitous.
Was there anything in this book writing process that you learned about yourself or that surprised you that kind of was like, whoa, I didn't actually know that I thought this, or I didn't actually think about my story in this way?
Well, there's a lot of this story that is my wrestling with a family history. And when I say that, right, like I think in particular with a whiteness, I think a lot of us, the natural idea is probably, oh, I bet he had to really find some skeletons in the closet. In fact, right, I think my family has a history that of a lot of real intense efforts to be do-gooders. And that doesn't mean that we weren't embedded in systems, and my family tree is not fully embedded in systems. I'm from South Dakota and Montana. We are the product of a Homestead Act, right? That we were embedded in systems, but like I was actually wrestling with a family of do-gooders, right? And I joke a lot that memoir is usually a genre in which you look at an aspect of your life that you have wrestled with or struggled with or not happy with, and you get to blame your parents. But in my case, my parents Dan and Jane Bucks did a pretty damn great job, which meant that all of this, right, all of this insecurity, all of this need for validation, all of this making efforts for justice about myself rather than about the common good, I had to ask if that didn't come from my parents. And in fact, if I have a story that I've held really tight to, that like I have a legacy I have to uphold, I have to do these things for my family that was entirely of my own creation, where did that come from? And how much of that was just weird Garret Bucks psychology that I had to wrestle with? How much of that was the combination of maleness and whiteness? And I think it's a real gift to have to sit with this question of how was I so insecure and so self-centered for so long without having the answer be because somebody else made a mistake. And for me, two things came out of that. One was this piece of saying that like, oh, there is so much less risk than I ever thought in living a life. I will always have a human brain with all of our insecurities and stuff like that, of course, right? But there's so much less risk than I thought in having a life more focused on questions and curiosities about other people rather than focus on myself and focus on, do people like me? Do people love what I'm doing? Which, by the way, is a great realization to have before you put a book out in the world, because it's really good to cleave yourself for the need to get external validation before you're about to have Goodreads on you, right? So great
Just
gift.
wait till you get your first negative Amazon review. You'll be like, ah.
I say I'm doing so great at this now. Yeah, Ryan, you can tell me, yeah, right? But then the other piece is, then there's a big piece of it that only is answerable in terms of my positionality in broader systems. A big piece is only comes from being socialized as white. A big piece of it comes only with the way I was socialized as being a guy. And realizing how much that was deeply embedded in me in ways that really, really took me in the opposite direction of who I wanted to be in life. That means that there's a connection point there, right? And it keeps coming up throughout this interview, but what I'm craving most is community. What I'm craving most is deeper and more connections with other people, and ones that are more authentic, rooted in the fact that we're all really struggling with somebody. And so that's one more realization of oh, if me being this weird wasn't uniquely my parents' fault, it's probably something that a lot of us actually have in common. And that means more opportunities for me to connect with other people who are in this mess. So I think that was a really big realization. And then also this big hope from the book, right? Like most books, I wrote the introduction after I wrote everything else. So I write in the introduction this invitation at the end, right? That I got to write my version, mediated by so many identity markers, mediated by some particularities of time and place as well. I got to write my version of why it didn't work trying to be the right kind of white. But now my hope for this book is that mine won't be the only version out there, right? That this both inspires other people to tell their stories, inspires other people to share their stories with me. And that I think that there's something really beautiful about the messiest things in our life, both individually and socioculturally, no longer keeping them in and no longer keeping them to ourselves. So that was a big takeaway.
Yeah. One other thing that's sort of up for me in my own journey is sort of somatic body, like Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands. We even talked about it in our last interview. He has this great quotation, and it's we can't think our way out of racism. And I'm curious, how does, if at all, do you work with body-based trauma around white people, or the somatic sort of effects of whiteness? Does that come into any of your, not that you personally work, but how does that show up at all for you or in your work?
It is not work that I focus on at all. It's not work that I have an expertise on. But what I do love, right, is what I do focus on, and what I do, I think, have some expertise on, is how to get white people talking across a wide variety of political and ideological divides about not what we claim to believe, but about what's really going on for us. And I am so grateful in the midst of this, right? And Menakem's book has been incredible for this, for so many people, that in the last few years, there's been an explosion of people who do have a deep connection to somatic work, right? And do have an expertise in it. And so there's this, I get the benefit from so many other people's, from a wide variety of the ways that people, when they're actually being honest about this is how I'm really messed up about this, I get a wide variety of benefit of how that comes up for people and different people's language and ability to do it. And so I then, one of which is 100%, because I get to benefit from hearing and learning from, and the connection that comes from hearing other people's somatic understanding, even if that's not the vantage point that I've approached it from.
And what do you hope for the book? So one of the questions we often ask ask guests is how can the listener support you? So when this podcast is going to be released, the book will be out. I believe what's the 19th? Is that right? Of March?
March 19th.
Yep.
Yeah.
So what is your hope for the book, and how can folks support you?
Yeah. Well, of course, every author would love that people buy their book. Every author would love that people request their book from the local library. Every author would love that people engage with the book fully and honestly with all their hearts, right? And that hopefully, right, that it finds people for whom really connect with it, right? But even if it doesn't connect with you, my hope would be that you engage with it with this question of what was Garrett trying to do with this book, right? So all of that is the hopes for every author and their dreams, right? In addition to that, what I would say is that this is a book that I really, really hope is engaged with in community, and that I hope is engaged with within workplaces. I think that it offers something as somebody who sat in a lot of white affinity group conversations that didn't really go anywhere. I think because we didn't really know what to say after we had said all the right answers. I think this opens up a style of storytelling that I would love to hear what happens in a workplace affinity group. I think it is going to be incredibly powerful. There's a lot of May wrestling with faith throughout this book, and faith and justice. And so I think that I can't wait for it to be wrestled with and experienced in faith-based groups. It is also very much a story about my educational upbringing, both as a student, as a college kid, and as an educator. And all of those settings, both as educators and as teenage and 20-something students, I think that this would have been the book that if I had been engaged with in a community when I was a 20-year-old, when I was a 17-year-old, would have been really powerful. And if my teachers had been engaging with it, would have been really powerful. And then it's a book that I really hope was engaged with friends. So why do I bring up all of this community engagement with my book? Well, A, because that's obvious. I hope that you don't just read it, but that share it and read it communally with somebody else. But then secondly, I would put myself out there for anyone listening to this podcast that I'm really, really down to then engage with you and your community on this book. If that means zooming into your book club, if that means answering questions, in some ways, if that means coming out to you and figuring out a way to do an event or workshop with you around this book, I want to both have your community engage with this book, and I would love to expand my web of communities that I care about and are connected to and are struggling with as well from it. So I am trusting, Ryan, there's probably going to be lots of different ways and links to this episode and stuff like that to be able to find me and contact me. But I do want to earnestly put that invitation out in addition to all the normal stuff, right? Read, buy, review, request, all totally appreciated. And if someone's listened to this side up to this point in the podcast episode, you've already engaged quite a bit with me now. And I'm already really grateful. So thanks.
Is there like a particular website or, we'll have some in the links, but if you want to just drop it.
Yeah. If you want to find everything, right? GarretBucks.com will take you to the white pages, my newsletter. It will take you, of course, for opportunities to find the book. We'll take you to a super easy contact form to reach out to me. And we'll also take you to the Barnraisers Project, which is the organizing home where I run organizing trainings. And I will have some of those available in the spring as well that are coming up. So all of that, GarretBucks.com will take you then to the whitepages.substack.com. We'll take you to barnraisersproject.org. We'll take you to all the links to buy the book. And I would love to connect with you. And by the way, Garret Bucks is GarrettBucks.
Love it. Maybe just a quick word on Barnraisers. So what is the current sort of like cadence that you're doing those cohorts? And is it still kind of the same when I took it a couple of years ago? Or
Yeah, so Ryan's referencing these cohorts that typically are 10 weeks long with class every other week. So you get to take 5 classes in a 10-week period virtually. And I am most likely doing another one of those 10-week ones in this fall that has not completely been set up. But what I'm doing right now in the spring, because my schedule is topsy-turvy with the book, is I've long wanted to offer kind of a more bite-sized offering. So throughout the spring, all this is up on the website, barnraisersproject.org. I'm offering 5 2-hour courses on introduction to organizing for justice in white communities. And so all of that easy to find. And then likely if you like that and then want to do a longer course, although this is not for certain yet, we'll be offering that in the fall. And the great news is at Barnraisers Project or contact me at GarretBucks.com, you get on the interest list. And every time I'm offering something new, you will be the first to find out about it.
Garrett, you're like a one-man media company. This is great. It's like
boom, 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 right? Yeah. Buy a couple domain and the world is yours.
I would also just put a plug out for, I feel like you can't really understand Garrett without the white pages also being on for folks, because, I'll just sort of toot your horn a little, Garrett, like some of the commentary that you provide on like white conservative rappers and like Nazis and just funny, well, serious but funny takes on like the Super Bowl and things like that. I just really value that. And so I would say get the book, but also the newsletter is sort of like where some of the secret sauce of Garrett comes out, I feel like.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I got jokes too, everybody. I got jokes because that is part of the work. We are wrestling with tough stuff, but it's a lot of ridiculousness in the midst of that too. So all that, yes, there's some jokes in the book, but there's definitely some jokes in the white pages. And Ryan, that's awful nice of you. Thank you.
Well, great, Garrett. It's been a pleasure to have you back on the show. I'm sure we'll do it again.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I just really enjoyed reading your book and I wish you the most success.
Oh, thank you. Ryan, this was fun. Appreciate you.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. Before you go, we wanted to let you know that our spring cohort of the Next Economy MBA begins on March 26th. If you're an entrepreneur seeking to create a business that works for all life, a member of a team looking to transition your organization into one that is more regenerative and democratic, or someone who's considering a career or livelihood transition and embodiment with your values, we designed this course for you. Over this 9-month learning journey, you'll have the chance to learn practical skills around business and life design based on our work with over 250 social enterprises. In addition to live sessions, you can deepen your experience and practice with special sessions, affinity groups, and connections with over 500 alumni who have participated in the course. Interested in learning more? Visit lifteconomy.com/MBA to view our course curriculum and sign up for a free intro with one of our facilitators. If you're ready to sign up, you can use the code PODCASTMBA to save 10% on tuition. We hope you'll join us.